My name is Caitlin. I am currently 42 years old and I live in the suburbs just outside Minneapolis with my husband Brandon. Officially, on all our documents, I am listed as a full time housewife. What very few people are aware of is that behind this seemingly quiet facade, I am actually the CEO of a medical equipment distribution company. This company successfully brings in millions of dollars in revenue annually. My personal salary from the company is around $145,000 per year, but Brendan has honestly never had the slightest clue about this. We first met at a friend's casual gathering right after I had turned 30. Back then, Brendan seemed like such a warm, attentive man. He had a genuinely charming way of speaking to people. He seemed to notice every single small detail about me. Things like how I naturally held my coffee cup with my left hand, or the specific way my eyes would light up whenever my favorite song was mentioned in conversation. I remember thinking to myself back then, if I could spend the rest of my life with someone like him, it would truly be the greatest blessing imaginable. We decided to get married after dating for nearly a year. At first, I honestly and truly believed that I had chosen the absolutely right person to share my life with. However, that seemingly lasting happiness we had at the beginning slowly but surely began to fade away. It started when Brendan gradually began to show more of his true self, and it wasn't what I had fallen in love with. He started making constant excuses for not actively trying to change his job, even though his current salary at the time barely covered our most basic living expenses. When I gently attempted to offer him suggestions or ideas, he would quickly brush them off. Sometimes he would even say things like, "Don't try to make me live by your standards." He would also add dismissively, "I'm not your employee, Caitlin." I tried to talk to him about exploring new job opportunities many times over the years. There was even a time when my own company had an opening in our administrative department. This was a role that only required basic communication skills and a professional attitude towards work. The salary for this position was actually more than double what Brandon was earning at his job. I even personally spoke to the head of our HR department to hold the position open for him for a short time. But when I carefully brought up this potential opportunity to Brendan, he frowned deeply and said, "You think I'm so completely useless that I need my wife to get me a job? Don't meddle in my business, Caitlin." I was absolutely stunned by his reaction and his words. I simply could not understand how someone who had once told me he loved me so deeply could now take my sincere advice and attempt to help as a personal insult. His stubbornness and pride completely baffled me. But even after being shut down and hurt like that, I just kept trying my best to endure the situation. I kept telling myself that as long as I was making enough money to keep our life stable and comfortable, everything would eventually work out between us. Every single month, I would regularly deposit a fixed amount of $400 into Brendan's personal bank account. This was meant to be his living allowance for personal expenses. However, he would consistently burn through that entire amount in less than 2 weeks. Then he would start texting me constant complaints about the high cost of food, the rising gas prices, and how generally stressful life was for him. I chose to stay silent during these times. It wasn't because I was unaware that he was spending the money on frivolous things, such as adding to his sneaker collections or buying things for online games he played. It was simply because I was too emotionally and physically exhausted to even try to argue with him about it anymore. With my significantly higher income, that amount of money itself wasn't truly significant to our overall finances. But what hurt me the most wasn't the money. It was his growing indifference and lack of consideration towards me and our life together. He never once genuinely asked if I was feeling tired after a long and demanding day at work. He never seemed to notice when I had to stay up late into the night answering important emails. He didn't notice when I had to fly to two different cities in one single week for business. In Brandon's eyes and perception, I was simply a woman who was living off the money he supposedly provided for our household. He truly believed he was the one working hard and sacrificing to keep our home together. I vividly remember one specific time when my mother came over to help tidy up the house for me while I was busy in online work meetings all morning. As soon as Brandon arrived home that afternoon, he tossed his keys carelessly onto the table. Then he said something out loud that instantly made my mother freeze in her tracks. He said, "Another stranger in the house again. I really need my peace and quiet, you know." I immediately stood up from my chair. I took a deep, steadying breath. Then I spoke to him through my clenched anger and frustration. "She is not a stranger, Brandon. She came here specifically to help us out. She did not come here to be disrespected like that by you." Brendan just responded with a casual shrug. He said dismissively, "That's just how you see it, Caitlin. But that's not how I see it. I have a right to feel uncomfortable in my own house, you know?" I turned away from him quickly, desperately trying to hide the tears that had instantly started to fall from my eyes. That specific moment and interaction was the very first time I felt a deep crack appear in our marriage, a crack that I knew even then might not ever be fully repaired. After that hurtful day, a strange and heavy silence settled between us. We still continued to live under the same roof. We shared dinner together sometimes. We occasionally watched the same TV show in the evenings, but everything between us felt incredibly cold, distant, and forced. There were no more random hugs given, no more genuine goodnight wishes exchanged. We were just two people living side by side, like strangers, as if the warm bond that had once existed between us had completely dried up and simply turned into a meaningless routine. Brendan gradually became increasingly irritable about everything. He would easily get angry over the littlest, most insignificant things, like a towel not being folded exactly the way he preferred it, or the TV remote control not being placed in the precise spot he expected it to be in. He even blamed me when the coffee machine stopped working, even though I knew for a fact he was the last person who had used it that morning. It genuinely felt like I had become his personal scapegoat for every little frustration or inconvenience in his life. I started to feel less like his wife and more like a paid maid in my own home that I secretly paid for. One particular evening, I came back home from an incredibly tense meeting at work. I hadn't even had a moment to take off my shoes yet. Brendan was standing in the kitchen holding up one of his shirts, and he just snapped at me. He barked, "This shirt isn't even ironed properly. Do you ever actually do anything right around here, Caitlin?" I gave a hollow, bitter laugh under my breath, swallowing down my rising anger and hurt. I thought to myself, I used to be a woman confidently running around pitching multi-million-dollar deals to major clients for my company. Now I was being questioned about whether I even knew how to properly use an iron. I chose to say nothing in response to him. I knew from painful experience that the more I attempted to talk or defend myself, the more he would twist my words, blame me unfairly and aggressively, tear into everything I was desperately trying so hard to preserve in our marriage. I was starting to feel completely drained and depleted emotionally. My physical body was holding up, but my spirit felt utterly worn, thin, and fragile. I remember another time when I had the flu. I was running a high fever and was unable to even get out of bed to care for myself. Brendan didn't come in to check on me or see if I needed anything. Instead of bringing me medicine or simply asking how I was feeling, he just stood in the doorway of the bedroom and said callously, "Hurry up and get better, Caitlin. I really don't have time to take care of you right now." I didn't expect him to become my personal nurse, but hearing those specific words from him sent a deep, chillingish shiver down my spine. That wasn't something a loving husband should ever say to his wife. That was something a complete stranger might say if they were reluctantly forced to live with someone they disliked intensely. The loneliness I felt in my own home became more and more overwhelming each day. I felt incredibly lost within my own life. When did the man who once tenderly held my hand at our wedding, promising to walk through life's journey with me, become the very person who hurt me the most deeply? At that low point, I started experiencing restless nights. I would often wake up suddenly in the middle of the night, just lying there wondering why I was still in this situation. Why was I a strong, successful woman who had successfully overcome so many significant obstacles in business and life, putting up with such a damaging and soul crushing relationship in my personal life? I didn't tell anyone about the true state of my marriage. Not even my dear mother, Frances. She had always loved and protected me fiercely, treating me like I was her greatest treasure in the world. She called me many times just to check in and see how I was doing, but I consistently told her that everything was perfectly fine. I didn't want her to worry unnecessarily about me. I didn't want anyone else to see or perceive my weakness and vulnerability in the situation. But I honestly never in a million years expected Brandon to intentionally drag my mother into our issues in the absolute worst possible way. One particular Saturday afternoon, my mother came over for a visit. She had thoughtfully brought my favorite homemade stew and a basket filled with fresh fruit from her garden. I was sitting and chatting happily with her in the living room when Brandon suddenly walked in through the front door. He took one quick look at my mother sitting there, sighed loudly in annoyance, dropped his bag onto the floor, and muttered under his breath, "Again, there's always someone just sitting around in this house." My mother was visibly startled by his rude comment, but she bravely maintained her gentle smile. She attempted to stay polite and calm. She replied softly to Brandon, "I'm just dropping by briefly to see my daughter for a little while, Brandon. I hope I'm not intruding on anything." Brandon just responded with another dismissive shrug. He then walked over to the fridge to grab a drink and spoke out loud as if I wasn't even sitting right there, or as if my mother was invisible. I really don't want to have dinner tonight with outsiders in my house, he said loudly. He added, directed towards no one in particular. Some people just clearly don't know how to respect boundaries. I sat there completely frozen in shock and disbelief at his blatant rudeness. In that painful moment, I saw my mother hesitate. She gently set the bowl of stew she had brought down onto the coffee table. She glanced at me with a look of sadness and concern in her eyes. Then she softly said to me, I think perhaps I should go now, Caitlin. I'll come by and visit you another time soon. My heart sank heavily in my chest as I walked her quietly to the front door. When the door shut behind her, I turned back to face Brendan. My voice was no longer holding back the hurt and anger I felt. I asked him directly, Brandon, do you even realize how incredibly hurtful you are being with your words and actions? He just looked back at me, completely unfazed and unapologetic. He replied coldly, I'm just being honest, Caitlin. If you can't handle honesty, that's entirely your problem, not mine. I stood perfectly still in the quiet kitchen for a very long time after that, just trying to process what had happened. The house suddenly no longer felt warm, safe, or like a home to me. Everything I had worked so hard to build in my life, including my marriage, now felt like it was slowly falling apart, piece by painful piece. At that precise moment, standing alone in the kitchen, I had absolutely no idea that just a few short weeks later, something major and completely life altering would happen. Something that would change absolutely everything in my life. And in my most vulnerable and fragile moment, Brandon would reveal his true colors and character more clearly and brutally than ever before. I don't remember the exact moment I collapsed physically. I only remember that the office lights around me seemed to dim suddenly, and then everything in my vision faded to blackness. When I next opened my eyes, I found myself lying in a hospital bed. I was in the emergency wing of the Mayo Clinic. There was an IV drip in my arm, and my head felt incredibly heavy, as if I had just been tossed around and battered by a terrible storm. The doctor later told me that I had fainted due to prolonged exhaustion and severe stress. He said I would need further medical tests because some of my initial readings were unusual and concerning. I didn't think much of it at the time, honestly. I had always considered myself a strong and resilient person, used to living a fast paced and demanding life. I just figured I would be perfectly fine after a few days of rest and recovery. But 2 days later, I was moved into a private hospital room to hear the official diagnosis from the doctor. We found a tumor in your pancreas, Caitlin, the doctor said, looking directly into my eyes with a serious expression. Fortunately, we seem to have caught it early, but you will need to start treatment immediately. This process is not going to be easy for you. I heard his words, but everything else in the room sounded muffled and distant as if I were underwater. The solid ground beneath me felt like it was suddenly slipping away. I wasn't necessarily afraid of the illness itself in that moment. I was terrified of the prospect of facing it all alone without any support. That same night, I sent a brief text message to Brendan. I simply told him I was in the hospital and that I urgently needed to talk to him. He didn't reply to my text message. I tried calling him next. His phone rang a few times and then it went straight to voicemail. Not a single message came from him. Not one word of concern or care. I began my intensive medical treatment without him by my side, completely alone. The infusions of medication drained my body of energy. My sense of taste faded away and my hair started falling out in clumps. Every time I looked in the hospital mirror, I saw a different woman staring back at me. She was frail and pale, yet her eyes still seemed to burn brightly with a determined will to live. I kept fighting the illness not just for myself and my own life, but also because I knew there was still something significant in my life that I hadn't fully let go of or resolved yet. I decided in my heart that I simply could not let Brendan walk out of my life so easily, especially after everything. He didn't deserve that easy exit without consequences. For 2 long weeks, I fought the illness alone in that hospital room. Not a single family member was physically there with me. I had lied to my mother, telling her I was away on a business trip. I didn't want her to worry excessively about my health. But then, unexpectedly, on a Thursday afternoon, Brandon actually showed up at the hospital. For a moment, I honestly thought I must be dreaming or hallucinating due to the medication. He just stood there at the hospital room door. His hands were casually in his pockets and his eyes looked cold and devoid of emotion. You're here, I said softly, my voice hoarse and weak from exhaustion and treatment. He didn't respond immediately. He slowly walked into the room. He placed a thin folder onto the bedside table next to me. Then he spoke in a cold, businesslike tone, as if he were negotiating a contract. "I've filed for divorce, Caitlin," he stated flatly. "The house and the car will be in my name. I think that arrangement is fair to both of us. As for you, well, I'm not even sure how long you'll actually be around anyway." I stared at him, completely stunned and speechless by his cruelty. Something deep inside of me shattered into countless pieces in that instant. It wasn't because he was abandoning me in my time of need. I had honestly already expected that possibility given his recent behavior. It was because of the sheer, chilling coldness and utter lack of humanity in every single word he spoke. He hadn't come to the hospital to check on my well being or offer support. He had come solely to claim what he selfishly thought he was immediately entitled to take from me. It was as if he viewed me as someone whose value had suddenly run out due to my illness. I pressed my lips tightly together, desperately hiding every single emotion I felt. I absolutely did not want him to see me appear weak or vulnerable in front of him. I simply nodded my head slightly and said quietly, my voice barely a whisper, "Take whatever you want, Brandon. Thank you for coming to visit me." Brandon paused for a moment. Perhaps he was surprised by how easily and calmly I seemed to agree to his demands. He shrugged indifferently. He then turned away from me and said one final cutting remark before leaving. "Not like you really have a choice in the matter anyway, Caitlin." When the door clicked shut behind him as he left, I didn't cry tears of sadness or hurt. Instead, a cold, determined smile slowly tugged at my lips. I whispered softly to myself, "You just woke up the real me, Brandon. And very soon, you are going to realize that you just made the biggest, most foolish mistake of your entire life." I reached for the bedside phone and made a call. I called the one person at my company that I trusted implicitly with everything. That person was Eric, my chief financial officer. Eric had always been fiercely loyal, incredibly discreet, and the one person who knew better than anyone just how much financial power and influence I truly held through the company. "Eric, I need your help with something important," I said into the phone. My voice was unusually calm and steady despite everything. He remained quiet for a brief moment on the other end. Then he responded simply and with understanding. "I've been waiting for this call, Caitlin. Just say the word and I'll make it happen." I nodded slightly, even though he couldn't see me doing so over the phone. I lay still in that sterile white hospital room. I watched the soft sunlight filter gently through the curtains covering the window. Strangely, I felt a profound sense of peace wash over me. Perhaps it was because I had finally made the firm decision to let Brandon go from my life for good. But I was not going to let him go in the weak and pathetic way he thought I would. He had wanted to discard me completely at what he perceived was my weakest moment. Fine. But in that pivotal moment, I realized that I was not the one who needed to be set free from a burdensome situation. It was actually him who needed to be freed. Freed from the comfortable life that I had single handedly carried and provided for on my back all these years. A life and a success he never even knew I was the one who had built and maintained. 3 days after that cold and heartless hospital visit from Brendan, Eric came to see me in person. He didn't bring flowers or sweets like a typical visitor might. Instead, he carried a sleek leather briefcase containing absolutely everything I needed to move forward with my plan. He set the briefcase carefully on the table beside my hospital bed and asked me gently, his voice full of concern, "Caitlin, are you absolutely sure you want to go through with this plan right now?" I looked directly at him. My gaze was unwavering and determined. "Yes, Eric," I replied firmly. "And I want everything to start happening tomorrow morning." Eric understood completely what needed to be done. He was the only person in the entire company who knew my secret. He knew that I had used my mother's name as the legal representative on official company documents to keep my true identity as the CEO hidden from almost everyone, including Brandon. I had always desired to live a modest and low-key life, never letting Brandon realize the full extent of my success. I never let him know that I was the powerful woman behind the major business contracts his own company depended on so heavily for revenue. Looking back now, maybe I had been too kind, too accommodating for too long. The very next morning, I signed a short but impactful letter. This letter formally terminated the supply agreement between my company SilverMed and VitalTech. VitalTech was the company where Brandon worked in the logistics department. That specific contract with my company had accounted for over 60% of VitalTech's total revenue just last quarter alone. And I knew because I was the one who had personally approved that contract after hearing their pitch nearly a year ago. I vividly remembered how incredibly excited Brandon had been back then. He boasted proudly to me that it was thanks to him and his efforts that his company had secured such a lucrative deal with a major business partner. All the while, he never once realized that major partner was me, his wife, sitting just one bedroom wall away from him in our house. The official contract termination letter was sent out by my lawyer at 8 a.m. sharp that Monday morning. By 3 p.m. that same afternoon, I received a direct phone call from the CEO of Vital Tech, a Mr. Peterson. He kept the conversation brief and to the point. Ms. Caitlin, he said politely, but with evident surprise in his voice. We are quite surprised by this sudden termination. If possible, we would greatly appreciate it if you could inform us of the reason for this action. I replied calmly, but with firm resolve in my voice. Mr. Peterson, I have recently been made aware that one of your employees has demonstrated inappropriate behavior. I stated clearly. This includes disrespect shown toward female colleagues and concerning signs of misusing company assets and resources. As a major partner and a company with ethical standards, I simply cannot condone or continue to do business with an organization that tolerates such conduct. There was a noticeable pause on the other end of the line before he asked, his voice now more serious. I understand, Miss Caitlin. What is the name of that specific employee? I answered him simply and directly without hesitation. His name is Brendan Scott. That same afternoon, Brendan came home to the house much later than usual. He looked pale and visibly shaken. He had absolutely no idea at that moment that I had already hired a private lawyer to file a counter-divorce petition against him. This time, my filing included a specific clause requiring him to vacate the house, which was legally under my sole name, within a strict 30-day period. That house, by the way, was a property I had personally bought years before we were married. I had only added his name to the deed later as a way to appease my prideful husband's ego and make him feel more secure. Brandon walked into the kitchen and opened the fridge to get some water without saying a single word to me. After a few moments of tense silence, he finally spoke softly, his voice sounding defeated. I got laid off from Vital Tech today, he admitted. I quietly set the book I was reading down onto the table. I wasn't in the least bit surprised by his news. Yes, I know, I replied calmly. It's because of the terminated contract with my company. He turned to look at me directly. His eyes were wide and filled with utter disbelief and confusion. How do you know about that, Caitlin? He stammered out. I slowly walked over to my desk in the living room. I opened a drawer and deliberately pulled out a thick envelope. I walked back and placed it squarely on the table between us. My voice was calm, perhaps to the point of being unnerving in its lack of emotion. Because Brandon, I said clearly, I am the one who ended that contract with Vital Tech. I am the CEO of SilverMed Brandon, the company that you so proudly claimed credit for winning over. The company that you genuinely thought you were smart enough and capable enough to simply convince and impress. Brandon literally froze in place where he stood. He stared at me as if he could not possibly believe what he was hearing me say. I continued speaking, laying out the full truth for him. For all these years we have been married, I have been the one paying every single bill for this house and our life. I covered all of your accumulated credit card debt without you knowing. I quietly paid the tuition expenses for your nephew when your cousin was going through hard financial times. I transferred over $1,500 into your account every single month as a living allowance, even when your actual salary from your job didn't even come close to covering that amount or your spending habits. I did all of that for you, Brandon, because at the time I genuinely believed in something called love and commitment. Brandon stumbled back a step or two. He reached out a trembling hand and grabbed the thick envelope from the table. He fumbled with it for a moment, then opened it with shaking hands. He quickly scanned the documents inside, then looked up at me again. His voice was barely a whisper, full of shock. This can't be real, Caitlin. I gave a small, humorless smile in response. They are the official divorce papers, Brandon, I stated plainly. They include the terms for asset division, and they contain your meeting schedule with my lawyer. You have exactly 30 days to move out of this house, and no, I will not be covering the $3,200 monthly mortgage payment for you anymore. He was utterly stunned into silence. The air around us in the room seemed to thicken with the tension, filled only by the sound of the heavy, ragged breathing of the man who had once leaned on me so completely, acting as if the whole world belonged to him and was provided by him. I simply turned and walked away from him, leaving him standing there alone, with the cold numbers and the brutal reality of the situation crashing down upon him. In my heart, at that moment, there was no intense hatred towards him, just a profound sense of clarity and resolution. Brendan had lived comfortably and obliviously for too long in the shadow of the success and security that I had quietly created and provided for him. Now it was finally time for him to step out of that shadow and be forced to face the consequences of his actions and confront everything he had so carelessly taken for granted in his life. Just 3 days after Brendan officially received the divorce papers from my lawyer, the phone in my hospital room rang near midnight. I was feeling completely exhausted from my second round of chemotherapy treatment. But when I saw his name suddenly appear on the phone screen, I knew right away what was happening. The panic and the consequences had finally begun to set in for him. Caitlin, please? His voice was shaky and raw, like he had been crying intensely. Just hear me out for a moment. I said nothing in response. On the other end of the phone line, I could hear the sound of a man in a complete freefall, his life collapsing around him, and I, the woman he had once casually left behind in a hospital bed, was now the only lifeline he was desperately clinging to for help. I was wrong, Caitlin, he pleaded desperately. I was so incredibly wrong about everything. I was stupid and arrogant. I honestly thought you were just some kind of dependent woman who relied on me for everything. But now I know the truth. You were the one who was holding everything together for us all along. You were the real reason my life didn't fall apart into chaos. I calmly put the phone on speakerphone mode. I leaned back against my pillows in the hospital bed and closed my eyes. I didn't do this because I was moved emotionally by his words or his desperation. I did it because I wanted to clearly hear every single desperate word he spoke. This was something I had once secretly wished for him to realize my worth, back when I was lying alone in that very same hospital bed, battling a serious illness completely by myself. Brendan continued speaking, his voice rising with frantic urgency and panic. I've lost absolutely everything now, Caitlin. The house is about to be foreclosed on because I can't possibly make the mortgage payments by myself. The company, Vital Tech, they didn't just fire me, they put a formal warning and documentation in my personnel file. No one else in the industry will even consider hiring me now with that on my record. Caitlin, please, I'm begging you. Give me another chance to make things right between us. I slowly opened my eyes again, watching the soft glow of the nightlight in the room. I felt calm and strangely cold as I finally spoke. A chance, Brandon? I asked quietly. You had a whole entire decade to show me respect, to truly love me, to share your life with me, to try and understand me. And you consciously chose not to do any of those things. Now that everything you were comfortably used to having is suddenly gone, now you finally realize my worth and what you lost. It's simply too late for that now, Brandon. He responded quickly, desperate to hold on. I know you're angry with me, Caitlin. But please remember, we were happy together once, weren't we? Please remember those good times we shared. I'm begging you, just try to remember. I allowed myself a faint, knowing smile. Brandon, I said softly, do you remember the name Alyssa? The other end of the phone line suddenly went completely silent. I could distinctly hear his breath catch sharply in surprise and fear. How how in the world did you find out about that, Caitlin? He stammered, his voice full of panic. I spoke calmly, each word sharp and precise, like the cut of a blade. The CEO of Vital Tech, Mr. Peterson, called me to apologize profusely for the situation with Brendan. I explained. He happened to mention that after I raised concerns, they quietly investigated an internal complaint that had been filed earlier. It turns out, Brendan, that you had a personal relationship with the new intern at Vital Tech. Her name is Alyssa Morgan. She's 24 years old, and she happens to be the daughter of the Chicago branch director for Vital Tech. Should I perhaps go into more detail about those late overtime nights you claim to be working at the office? Brandon immediately started stammering incoherently on the other end of the line. No, Caitlin, it's not what you think it was. It wasn't like that at all, I swear. I simply responded, calmly cutting him off. You're absolutely right, Brandon. It wasn't what I thought it was. It was far, far worse than I ever imagined. Without saying another word, I ended the call. Immediately after hanging up, I opened my phone contacts and hit the block button on his number. I also immediately emailed my lawyer, Eliza Harper, requesting a formal no contact clause be put in place during the ongoing divorce proceedings. I also instructed her to begin preparing a civil lawsuit against Brandon for breach of marital duty based on infidelity. In the state of Minnesota, with concrete proof of infidelity, the betrayed spouse is legally allowed to file for emotional and financial damages. And I knew I had more than enough evidence of betrayal. The very next morning, my lawyer Eliza Harper came to visit me at the hospital. She showed me a thick stack of screenshots she had obtained. These were from conversations between Brendan and Alyssa. They contained flirtatious messages exchanged between them, details about hotel meetups, and even selfies they had taken together inside the Vital Tech office after hours. All the screenshots were time-stamped and geotagged with location data. I wasn't shocked or upset by the evidence. I just felt a profound sense of relief wash over me. Every single suspicion I had previously pushed aside or ignored now had a concrete name and undeniable proof attached to it. We've sent a formal demand to Brandon for $85,000 in damages, Caitlin, Eliza informed me calmly. He will likely attempt to contest it initially, but with all this compelling evidence, the court will undoubtedly be on your side. I simply nodded my head in agreement. It wasn't because I desperately needed the money. My own income was far beyond that amount. It was because I needed my dignity and self-respect to be publicly acknowledged and placed back where it rightfully belonged after everything he had done. A week later, I was temporarily discharged from the hospital. I was to continue my recovery and monitoring at home. During that time, Brendan desperately tried multiple ways to contact me. He sent emails, tried reaching out through social media, and even showed up physically at my company's office building. He didn't know that our security team had already been given strict instructions not to allow him anywhere near the premises or to see me. Every single attempt he made to try and win me back only served to confirm one clear thing to me: Brendan didn't truly love me as a person. He simply did not know how to live comfortably and financially supported without me in his life. I began the process of completely rewriting my financial plans for the future. This time, there was no longer a budget category for a husband's living expenses. I also approved Eric's recommendation to hand over the COO Chief Operating Officer role at SilverMed to a highly qualified new hire. This decision allowed me to step back slightly from the day-to-day operations, slow down my demanding pace, focus on my health, and finally truly enjoy some much-needed peace in my life. And when I stood on the balcony of my beautiful new home, the one I moved into after finally leaving the old house that held so many painful memories, I closed my eyes. I felt the cool, refreshing breeze gently brushing through the short new hair that had just begun to grow back after completing my medical treatment. In that moment, I knew a deep truth. I didn't need a man in my life to feel worthy, valuable, or complete. I just needed myself strong, clear-headed, and determined. And I vowed to myself that I would never again let anyone else define my worth or dictate the direction of my life. Rumors about Brandon's sudden downfall spread incredibly quickly like wildfire throughout the local business community in Minneapolis. Vital Tech had terminated their major contract with SilverMed, and Brandon's personnel termination file, which included details about his inappropriate behavior, was quietly circulated among partner companies and industry contacts. Soon enough, Brandon Scott became a name that everyone in the business world wanted to avoid associating with. He was a logistics employee caught in a public scandal and facing potential legal consequences for breaching his marital duty. With nowhere else to immediately go after being required to vacate the house, Brendan temporarily moved in with an old friend. He ended up in a cheap apartment complex located in Brooklyn Park. A few weeks later, I heard through the grapevine that he had been forced to sell the car he once so proudly called his symbol of freedom. Part of the money from the sale had to go towards paying off his accumulated credit card debt, the very same cards he had used so freely to buy expensive gaming gear and lavish meals for himself. Because he now had a stain on his professional record and lacked practical skills that were in demand, no reputable company wanted to hire him. Eventually, he was forced to accept a job working the night shift at a local delivery center. However, the meager paycheck from this low-wage job was barely enough to cover his monthly bills and expenses. Calls from aggressive collection agencies started piling up daily. His small apartment often echoed with the sound of late-night phone rings. These calls weren't from loved ones checking in, but from places relentlessly chasing unpaid debts. As for Alyssa, the young woman who had once laughed and flirted with Brandon after hours at the Vital Tech office, she seemed to vanish completely from social media just days after the scandal involving Brandon broke publicly. I didn't know what had truly happened to her until my lawyer Eliza informed me. Alyssa's family had agreed to settle part of the damages claimed privately with my lawyer. They did this to avoid a potentially messy and public legal litigation process that could damage their own reputation. Word had it that her parents immediately took her back to their family farm in Iowa and completely cut off all ties she had with her former life in the city. For her parents, that was the only way they felt they could potentially salvage the family's reputation after the embarrassing incident. As for me, my final round of medical treatment for the pancreatic tumor ended on a crisp, cool autumn morning, when the doctor looked at me with a warm smile and said, "Caitlin, your test results show you are completely clear of cancer." I didn't speak a word initially. I just smiled back at him and gently squeezed his hand in gratitude. In that powerful moment, I felt truly reborn. I returned to work at SilverMed after taking 2 months off for rest and recovery. But this time, I wasn't the same Caitlin who had desperately tried to balance a demanding career with a failing marriage. Now I was simply Caitlin living life on my own terms and according to my own values. I was focused, calm, and no longer weighed down by anyone who consistently failed to see or appreciate my true worth and strength. My company welcomed me back with a simple but heartfelt team meeting. Everyone on the staff stood up and warmly clapped when I entered the main conference room. My CFO, Eric, smiled broadly and handed me a personalized mug that read, "Welcome back, boss." There was a time during my illness and the divorce when I had sincerely doubted whether I would ever be able to start over and rebuild my life successfully. But in that precise moment, surrounded by my supportive team, I knew with absolute certainty. Not only had I come back to work and to life, I had come back significantly stronger, wiser, and more resilient than ever before. In the months that followed my return, I received more than just a few invitations for dates. Some came from business partners I had worked with professionally. A few came from old friends who had followed my personal story online. But I politely turned them all down for the time being. It wasn't because I had closed my heart forever to the possibility of love again. It was because I knew that I still needed more time to truly heal emotionally and spiritually. I needed time to simply enjoy living a life that was no longer bound by the heavy responsibility of constantly trying to please or provide for someone who was fundamentally unworthy of my efforts and love. I decided to buy a small, peaceful lakeside house located in Duluth. It was a place where I could wake up each morning and watch the beautiful sunrise over the water. In the evenings, I could sit and listen to the calming sounds of the birdsong. It wasn't a grand or luxurious mansion like the old house I had left behind, but it was my own personal space. It felt peaceful, complete, and entirely mine. And no one, absolutely no one, entered unless they were specifically invited by me. One particular weekend afternoon, while I was quietly brewing tea in the kitchen of my new lakeside house, Eric stopped by for a visit. We sat together on the porch overlooking the lake, watching the water shimmer beautifully under the golden light of the sunset. "Have you thought at all about getting married again someday?" Eric asked me with a half teasing smile. I looked at him and smiled softly in return. "Not right now, Eric," I replied honestly. "Maybe someday in the future. But for now, I am perfectly happy just like this on my own." He nodded in understanding, saying nothing more about it. The gentle breeze carried the fresh scent of pine trees and damp earth from the surrounding woods. And in that peaceful moment sitting there by the lake, I knew a deep truth in my heart. I realized I hadn't just overcome the challenges presented by Brandon or the difficult battle with illness. I had successfully overcome the debilitating fear that had once kept me silent, trapped, and enduring an unhealthy situation for far too long in my life. I took a slow sip of my hot tea, thinking quietly to myself. In the end, I became the sole author of the final chapter of my own life story. From my personal journey through pain and adversity, I have learned a powerful lesson. True resilience and strength don't always come from the moments when everything is going well or when we feel strong. Instead, they come most powerfully from the difficult times when we find the courage and inner strength to rise back up again after being pushed down to our absolute lowest point in life. I had once given my heart and my life to someone who was fundamentally unworthy of that gift. I had once sacrificed my own well being and endured hardship in silence without recognition or appreciation. But now my life was different. Now I was genuinely living for myself and my own happiness. I was no longer trying desperately to please anyone else or seek validation from others. I realized that my true happiness and freedom began the exact moment I consciously chose to prioritize my own self respect and well being above absolutely everything else in my life. What are your thoughts on Caitlin's challenging journey and her incredibly decisive choices? Share your insights and feelings in the comments section below this video. And please don't forget to subscribe and follow the channel for more powerful, authentic, and heartfelt real life stories about family relationships and overcoming adversity.